Mrs. Fairfax answered the door herself. She was one of those plump, comfortable ladies with swathes of butter-coloured hair coiled round her head. Mrs. Fairfax looked from Sophie to Michael. She'd seen Sophie last a year ago as a girl of 17, and there was no reason for her to recognise her as an old woman of 90. "Good morning," she said. "This is Lettie Hatter's great-aunt," said Michael. "I brought her here to see Lettie." "Then do come in. Lettie's a little bit busy just now, but have some scones and honey while you wait." She opened her front door wider. Instantly a large collie dog squeezed past and ran out. Mrs. Fairfax flew off in pursuit. "Oh, stop him! I don't want him out just now." They chased the dog round the side of the house, and as Michael caught hold of him, he nodded towards a distant grove of apple trees. Sophie looked over, and there was Howl, on one knee before Lettie, holding her hand, and Lettie's eyes were shining with devotion. Mrs. Fairfax caught them up, panting. "Oh, bad dog," she whispered to the collie. "I'll put a spell on you if you do that once more." She pointed a stern finger. "Into the house." The collie shook himself free of Michael's hands and slunk away round the house again. "Thank you so much," said Mrs. Fairfax, as they all followed it. "He will keep trying to bite Lettie's visitor." "He may have the right idea," said Sophie. "Mrs. Fairfax, do you know who Lettie's visitor is?" Mrs. Fairfax chuckled. "The Wizard Pendragon, or Howl, or whatever he calls himself. But Lettie and I don't let on we know. It amused me when he first turned up, calling himself Sylvester Oak, because I could see he'd forgotten me, though I hadn't forgotten him, even though his hair used to be black in his student days. I said to Lettie, 'Here's your big chance, my love. Here's Wizard Howl courting you, and you could do worse than fall in love with him and let him be your teacher. The pair of you will go far.' I don't think Lettie was too keen on the idea at first, but she's been softening lately." Sophie broke in, "But someone told me Lettie was fond of someone else." "Sorry for him, you mean," said Mrs. Fairfax. She lowered her voice. "There's a terrible disability there," she whispered suggestively. "And it's asking too much of any girl. I told him so. I'm sorry for him myself." Sophie managed a mystified "Oh?" But Michael, who kept looking nervously to the corner of the house in case Howl came round it and discovered them, said, "I think we'd better be going." As Michael and Sophie walked purposefully down the path to the gate, Sophie said, "Mrs. Fairfax, wasn't it my niece Martha who was supposed to come to you?" Mrs. Fairfax smiled. "Naughty girls, as if I wouldn't recognise one of my own honey-based spells. But as I said to Lettie at the time, I'll have no pretence. You stay as your own self or not at all. And it's worked out very happily, as you see." Michael collected the 7-league boots from the hedge and set one down outside the gate for Sophie. "I'm going to hold on to you this time," he said, and he took hold of Sophie's arm and pulled. Both boots came down, and Mrs. Fairfax's talk vanished in the zip and rush of air. Next moment, Michael had to brace his feet in order not to collide with the castle. That afternoon, Michael went to his workbench and started on making spells. But things didn't seem to go right. After a while, he turned to Sophie. "I'm stuck. You don't think you could help me, do you?" "Let's have a look," she said. "I don't know anything about magic, you know." Michael thrust a strange, slightly shiny paper into her hand. It looked unusual, even for a spell. "See what you think." Sophie read, "Go and catch a falling star. Get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who cleft the devil's foot. Teach me to bear the mermaid singing, or to keep off envy's stinging, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. Decide what this is about. Write a second verse yourself." It puzzled Sophie exceedingly. She ploughed through it twice. "It looks to me like a set of impossible things to do." "But if the things were impossible," Michael pointed out, "no one would ever be able to do the spell." For the rest of the day she and Michael sat staring into the distance, throwing out suggestions at one another. Eventually Sophie said, "Let's have supper." They ate bread and cheese, still staring into the distance. At last Sophie said, "Why not try just doing what it says? Where's the best place to catch a shooting star? Out on the hills?" "Can we?" said Michael. "Shooting stars go awfully fast." "So can we," said Sophie, "in 7-league boots." Michael sprang up and scrambled for the boots. "I think you've got it. Let's go and try." Michael was turning the doorknob blue down when 2 strange things happened. On the bench the teeth of the skull started clattering, and calcifer blazed right up the chimney. "I don't want you to go," he said. "We'll be back soon," said Michael. They went out into the street in Porthaven and stumped along until they left the lighted windows behind and the night became wide and damp and chilly. The Milky Way looked like a band of mist risen from the marshes, and the keen stars twinkled through it. Michael and Sophie stood, each with a boot ready on the ground in front of them, waiting for one of the stars to move. An hour went by, and Sophie was about to give up and go home when one of the stars came unstuck from the firmament and darted in a white streak down the sky. "There's one!" she shrieked. Michael thumped his foot into his boot and was off. Sophie braced herself with her stick and was off a second later. Zip! Swoosh! Sophie stabbed her stick into the ground and managed to stand still. Michael was a sploshy sound of madly running feet somewhere ahead. And there was the falling star. Sophie could see it, a little white descending flame shape, coming down slowly now, and it looked as if Michael might catch it. Sophie set off at a top hobble. Her eyes were on that little white light. By the time she caught up, Michael was stalking the star with soft steps, both arms out to catch it. The star was drifting level with Michael's hands, and only a step or so beyond. It was looking back at him nervously. How odd, thought Sophie. It was made of light, and yet it had big, anxious eyes, peering backwards at Michael, and a small, pointed face. Sophie's arrival frightened it. It gave an erratic swoop and cried out, "What is it? What do you want?" "I only want to catch you," said Michael. "I won't hurt you." "No, no," cried the star. "I'd rather die." It swooped for the nearest marsh pool, and the black water leaped into a blaze of whiteness for just an instant. Then there was a small, dying sizzle. When Sophie hobbled over, Michael was standing watching the last light fade out of a little round lump under the dark water. "That was sad," said Sophie. Michael sighed. "Yes, let's go home. I'm sick of this spell." As they trudged dejectedly through the dark streets of Porthaven, Michael said, "This spell's too advanced for me. I'll have to ask Howl. I hate giving in, but at least I'll get some sense out of Howl now this Lettie Hatter's given in to him." This didn't cheer Sophie up at all.